I went to two of the most interesting vortex points on Earth pretty much back to back.
Oh,
I was
really?
Yeah. Back in the 60s and early 70s, Ivan T. Sanderson was doing a lot of research on places where planes and ships would disappear. And the iconic book, The Bermuda Triangle, that was written by Charles Berlitz. Charles Berlitz, as it turns out, actually went to Ivan Sanderson's research center and purloined most of the data that he got for that book out of that research center. But the thing is that Sanderson actually had found 12 points on the surface of the Earth where these ships and planes were all disappearing, not just one.
Huh.
But Berlitz only used the one. Now, it just so happens that one of these points is directly over Hawaii, and the more north you are in Hawaii, the closer you are to this vortex point. Now, again, in certain circumstances, when the alignments are right, there is a energetic effect that will happen in these areas that can disrupt electromagnetic equipment. It can cause navigation systems to go down. But there's also a very fascinating side note to this, which is that in certain circumstances, there are disappearances. And it appears that what's happening is that these ships and planes are actually traveling out of time as we know it and probably into some other time. And so I've been working like crazy on this book, which has taken me about 14 months of really hardcore work to finish.
That's pretty intensive.
And I wanted to take a vacation, and so I had been writing about these vortexes extensively. And Kauai is the northernmost island on Hawaii, and the vortex is north of Hawaii. Richard Hoagland has pointed out in the past that Hawaii has the lowest cancer rate of anywhere in the world, and another one of the things these vortexes seem to do is they have a bioactive component, which can actually induce healing. And so, sure enough, I went to this island. There's one island that's north of Kauai that's only run by indigenous people, and you can't even go there unless they allow you to. I forget what it's called, but it starts with an N. There was a lot of rain. It was very humid, but we had a beautiful place. I was actually staying at David Wolf's raw food farm called Noni Land, which is not open to the public. It's like a private farm. And so I went to the beaches, and there were these terrifying signs that said that there was a riptide, and there was this, and there was that, and it was lethal, and, you know. We went swimming in there anyway, and the waves were really intense. I actually, more than once, got completely knocked off my feet, shot, I don't know, it seemed like over 100 feet through the water. Somehow managed to, like, tuck my head in and avoid taking some kind of serious injury as I was getting thrown around inside the water. But this was my vacation, you know, because I never, ever take any time off. I mean, George, I hope you can, but
well, you know me. I get 3 weeks, only take one. You know, it's the same way. But was one of these islands, was that Nahoa?
I think that's it, yeah.
That might be it.
Yeah.
I've got a lot of friends on the big island of Hawaii.
Right.
And, you know, they love it. They love it out there.
Well, there was a lot of energetic activity there, that's for sure. And I managed to blow out a rewrite of the book while I was there, as well as a conference and a radio show and 2 videos and all kinds of stuff. So I didn't really stop working at all. That's the point.
Now, well, these vortexes where ships and things have disappeared, you say that there were 12 points, and you went to see these 2 of them. How did he even find where they were? Well,
it's very simple. Every time that you go through the aviation records to the dawn of biplanes and the very first powered flight as it went back to the Wright brothers, every time a plane disappears, there's a log of it. And so what he did is he went through all that stuff, he crunched the numbers, and he took little push pins and stuck them into a map every time there was a plane that went down. And then he did the same thing for marine records, going back as far as Spanish conquistadors and stuff in the 1500s.
Interesting.
And looked for where ships disappeared. And eventually, if you have enough push pins with little pieces of paper attached to them that tell you what they mean, and you start noticing that they're all clustering into what initially he only thought were 10 points, and they're all basically 72, like there's 5 in the northern hemisphere and 5 in the southern hemisphere, and they're 72 degrees longitude apart from each other in these hemispheres. 36 degrees of longitude apart if you look from top to bottom. 72 if you look at just one hemisphere at a time. But they were totally perfectly offset from each other, and it was actually 3 Russian scientists who published in a mainstream Russian science journal called Kimya i Zin, which means chemistry and life. These Russians were Goncharov, Morozov, and Makarov. I've spoken about them before. They actually did this totally mainstream scientific paper where they played connect the dots and found out that, in fact, there was a geometric object that was formed that appears to be an energy field inside the Earth. They did not say it was like a big crystal, but it was some sort of energetic pattern inside the Earth that was actually causing this. In other words, every time you have one of these vortex points, it's one of the corners of this geometry, which basically is like a soccer ball made out of equilateral triangles, a total of 20 of them.
Explain what a vortex is, David. For people.
A vortex point has a variety of very interesting effects that will happen around it, including you can get fish and sea turtles that will swim with the vortex. You actually do get vortexes, currents in the ocean in terms of how the ocean is flowing. Many storms will begin in these centers. Hurricanes will begin in these areas. Electrical fish tend to cluster in these areas, and they don't go anywhere else. You also get gravitational anomalies. You get magnetic fluctuations in the Earth's geomagnetic field. And one of the most interesting things is that they actually determine the structure of the continents. I personally interviewed in 2005 Dr. Hanshao Liu, L-I-U, who works for NASA and the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association. And he collaborated with another guy named Dr. Athelstan Spilhaus on a paper that Spilhaus published in 1976, where what they basically did is they looked at Pangaea, which is the original landmass where all the continents fit together on Earth. And Liu, this guy, was the first one to discover that when Pangaea broke up into separate island continents in the early days, it did so along geometrically equal lines. Now, that's pretty strange. Why would it do that? Why wouldn't it just be random? What could be causing this geometry to occur in the spreading of the continents? Well, then it got even weirder because they found that the original geometry was what Richard has always spoken about, the tetrahedron, and I'm sure you listeners are well aware of that one. It's basically a pyramid, but with a triangular base rather than a square base. Each face of which there's 4 is equilateral triangle. But then you get up to the next phase where it becomes a cuboctahedron, and that's a little bit more complex, where you have triangular faces and square faces. But nonetheless, what they found was that if you actually go back and look at the isochronic seafloor spreading data, as it's called, which is basically just means how you measure in time how the volcanic undersea ridges have spread out the continents, they're doing so along absolutely precise geometry. And then thirdly and lastly, it expands into what's called an Icasa dodecahedron, which is the pattern that we now have. And, of course, Ivan Sanderson discovered the Icasa component, which is the 12 sides, or the 12 vortex points that connect together if you play connect the dots. The Russians I just mentioned also figured out you could flip it inside out and get a dodecahedron. Now, when Hanshao Liu and Athelstan Spilhaus discovered this same thing and made maps of it, they had no idea that Sanderson had discovered 12 vortex points. They had no idea that the Russians had identified the same exact geometry. They discovered it independently 3 years later by actually analyzing the positions of the continents.
David, on your travels, you've been checking in on some crop formations. Tell me about that.
Well, as I was saying before, taking a vacation after writing this book, I really wanted to visit some of these vortex formations that I've been writing about. As I was saying to you, I had this unified quantum model where I'm starting to see that geometry is what ties us all together and that real dematerialization is possible. because particles are doing this all the time. Even atoms are popping in and out of this parallel reality all the time. So when I realized, well, now I have a little bit of money and I have some time I can actually take a vacation, I wanted to hit off Hawaii first, and then I had already booked this trip to go see the crop circles in England.
Ah.
So I only gave myself, I kind of screwed up my booking. I didn't really think it through. I only ended up giving myself 1 day's full layover in L.A. before I had to turn around, get back on the plane again, and fly all the way over to London. So I got pretty jet-lagged. And I have a whole long thing that I wrote on my website, divinecosmos.com, about all that, and just the personal story of the trip. And there's some wonderful and crazy stuff that happened. But the part I didn't write about that I was saving for the show is what happened with the crop circles. Now, I was traveling with this guy, Kevin Fitzgerald, who I've been working with for 8 years doing sacred tours and stuff. And he has a thick Massachusetts accent. His last name, Fitzgerald. He's actually the fifth cousin of JFK, John Fitzgerald
I was going to
Kennedy.
ask you that. Okay.
Yeah, he's actually JFK's fifth cousin. And so he's got this thick Boston drawl, He says, we're going to see a circle every day. Every day we're here, we're going to see a circle. I'm like, oh, my God. Don't promise what you can't deliver. I was hoping we were just going to see one. Because here's the deal, George. We have this gigantic coach, this big bus, and I knew that these are on farms in the middle of the countryside of southern England.
Sure. With
single-lane roads that probably have gravel and potholes and gosh knows what. I mean, I was very concerned because sometimes the farmers won't let you go into these formations. We also had a full itinerary. We were supposed to see Avebury, Stonehenge, Glastonbury, and then Salisbury Cathedral. And over and above all that, there were a series of obviously fake crop circles. One of the problems that's been happening is that the real ones have generated so much interest that the fake ones are now being made in greater and greater numbers. And they go out there and they make fairly convincing-looking fake crop circles. But
they're good. They're very good, aren't they?
Oh, yeah. And look, I mean, people have filmed themselves doing it, and they've taken credit for it, and you actually see the photographs of them doing all the work. That's a fact. Now, who's financing them and why might be another thing we could get into if we want to put the tinfoil hat on.
Uh-huh.
Nonetheless, to stay on the facts, you can go back to 815 A.D. if you remember Jacques Vallée, right?
Uh-huh.
Jacques Vallée wrote his book, Passport to Magonia. Well, the reason why I called it that is that one of the most interesting early UFO contactee cases comes from 815 A.D., where these people in France alleged to have been abducted, and they didn't call it an abduction, they didn't say it was anything scary, by these beings that look like us that they called sylphs, S-Y-L-P-H-S. The sylphs took them on what they referred to as a cloud ship, obviously something that flies in the air,
mm-hmm.
and gave them a ride in the cosmos through outer space, told them a lot of interesting things, and brought them back and said to them, the reason why we are making these crop circles is that, if you just let us do this and let us, do this business that we need to do by making these crop circles, then we'll help you by making sure that your weather is good. So it was like
they're not helping us.
Well, this was 1,200 years ago. So the thing that's so interesting about this is that the Archbishop of Lyon in France was the equivalent of the government back then because church and state were one. You didn't have a separation like you do now. Because remember, we're dealing with 815 A.D. So if you want to get something done, you go to the Archbishop. So the farmers, well, even before we get to that point, but I'll finish that thought first, the farmers actually went to the Archbishop and complained because the pagans were taking crops out of crop circles and using them for fertility rituals. So the Archbishop actually had to issue an edict formally prohibiting the locals from taking out crops from crop circles. So we have a documentation that's 1,200 years ago of these crop circles forming. Now,
They just want them left the way they were, I guess.
well, the other thing that was interesting, which I was going to say before that, was that when these people came back and told their story, the villagers were going to burn them at the stake because they said, well, sylphs are demonic and you guys are now touched by the devil, and this is really scary, and, we don't know what you're going to do to us, and you might have magical powers now, so we're going to burn you alive.
Well, I could understand how people of that era could have thought that. That happens.
It's a frequent mistake that they make. But
yes.
So the archbishop actually had to, even before he made this edict about crop circles, he had to issue another decree where he basically said there are no such thing as sylphs, there are no such thing as cloud ships, and there are no such thing as evil sorcerers. And it was only by his intervention that he saved these people from being burned alive.
Well, I wonder what his real thoughts were, though, personally.
Well, again, I think that given the fact that he was an archbishop, and given what we're now finding out about the lineage of information that has remained unbroken for thousands of years, I would say he knew exactly what was going on.